Hello, boys and girls. I hope you are ready to read our next couple of chapters. Today we are going to read chapters 13 and 14. And when you're done today, you're going to complete a reading response just like what we used to do in our reading journals. You will tell me just your thoughts on this chapter. What did you like? What did you dislike? Was there something that made you feel excited or scared or happy? So be thinking while I'm reading, what are some things that you want to make note of in this chapter? Chapter 13. Strong arms lifted George up. He felt himself being carried. "Papa," he said. "Papa?" Why did his head hurt so much? Had the panther knocked him out of the tree? Was he sick with a fever like Mama? And whose voice was whispering in his ear? "Giorgio, Giorgio, wake up." Giorgio opened his eyes. Marco's amber eyes shone down on him. This was no dream. He was not sick. The Titanic was sinking. The bow of the ship was completely underwater now, and waves swept over the deck. Lounge chairs sailed past them and crashed over the side. People clung to the rails. A few slipped and were swept overboard. Marco had wrapped one arm around the railing and the other around George. "It's time to go," Marco said. "Go where?" George said, even though he knew. They were going into the water. There was nowhere else for them to go. Marco held George's arm as they climbed over the railing. "When we jump as far out as you can," Marco said, "away from the ship." George filled his lungs with the icy air. "Jump!" Marco cried. George pushed with his feet and leaped off the boat. He closed his eyes, imagining that they had enormous wings that would take him soaring into the sky. But then he hit the water, and down he went. And just when he was sure his lungs would pop, the ocean seemed to spit him back up. George sputtered. The water was so cold it felt like millions of needles stabbing him. It hurt so much he couldn't move. Someone grabbed him by the life jacket and started dragging him away from the ship. It took George a few seconds to realize that it was Marco. He stopped to grab a door that was floating by. After helping George climb on top, Marco found a crate for himself. It wasn't big enough to keep his feet out of the water, but it was better than nothing. The crate had a rope attached to it. Marco tied it around his arm and handed the end to George. "Hold tight," he said. They turned and stared at the ship. The entire front was underwater, and the back had risen toward the sky. It groaned and squeaked and sparked. Black smoke poured from its funnels, and the lights flickered. It was like watching a fairy tale dragon, stabbed and bleeding, fighting for its life. And finally, it seemed to give up. The groaning stopped, the lights went dark, and the Titanic sank into the bubbling black water, down, 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 until George closed his eyes. He couldn't make himself watch Mr. Andrews' beautiful ship disappear. A sound rose up around him. People calling for help. More and more people screaming and yelling, hundreds of voices swirling together like a howling wind. Marco pulled George away from the people and the wreckage. George couldn't believe how strong he was, how hard he kicked, how his arms sliced through the water. When he finally stopped, Marco was gasping for breath, exhaling cold clouds of white mist. He tightened the rope around his arm and patted George on the shoulder. "I rest now, Giorgio," he said breathlessly. He closed his eyes and put his head down on the crate. Soon. Soon what? George was afraid to ask. Soon it would be over? Soon they would be rescued? Or soon they would be swallowed up by the darkness? George heard men talking somewhere close by. He looked around, relieved that he wasn't by himself, and to his shock, just ahead, he saw a lifeboat. "Marco," he said, "wake up!" But Marco didn't move. His arms hung off the side of the crate. His feet dangled in the icy water. "Marco, we need to get to that boat." But Marco was still, and George realized that his friend had used every last ounce of strength. He'd gotten George off the sinking ship and across the icy waters. It was up to George now. He tucked the rope under his body and started paddling. The water seared his hands and arms. It was so cold it felt boiling hot like lava. But he didn't stop until he reached the boat. It wasn't a regular wooden lifeboat. It was much smaller and made of canvas cloth. There were about 10 people crowded inside, mostly men. They all seemed dazed and frozen. Nobody spoke as George paddled up and grabbed hold of the side, but somebody pushed his hand off. "Get back," a voice said weakly. "You'll put us all in the water." "Please," George said. "We need help." George put his hand up again, but again someone pushed it off. And so George pulled Marco to the other side of the boat. He tried again. Nobody helped him, but this time nobody stopped him. It took him 3 tries, but he managed to hoist himself over the side and tumble into the boat. And now for Marco. He got up on his knees and leaning over, bracing his legs against the side of the boat as he grabbed Marco under the arms. He pulled, but Marco was attached to the crate by a rope. He tried again, yanking the rope, digging at the knot with his frozen fingers, but the knot was like rusted metal. George struggled, and water sloshed over the side of the boat. "Just let him go," one of the men said weakly. "It's hopeless." But George kept working on the rope, trying now to break it away from the crate. He was pulling so hard that at first he didn't notice that Marco was slipping into the sea. "Please, somebody!" George screamed. "Can't you help us?" A woman from the front of the boat climbed back to George. She wore a black coat, her head and face hidden by a flowered shawl. As she pushed George aside, she pulled something out of her coat. A knife! With a clean cut, she sliced the rope and helped George pull Marco into the boat. Her hands looked surprisingly strong. George fell back, exhausted. "Thank you," George said to the woman through his chattering teeth. The woman didn't say anything, and suddenly George noticed the knife, a Bowie knife with an elk horn handle. George looked up under the shawl. 2 glittering blue eyes looked back at him. The scar-faced man. He had saved Marco's life. Without a word, he handed George his knife. Then he looked away. Chapter 14. The cold pressed down on George until it seemed to crush his bones. He huddled close to Marco, trying to keep them both warm. Marco barely moved. Some of the men sang softly. Others prayed. Some made no sounds at all. Hours went by. The sea became rougher, and every few minutes a wave splashed into the boat. George was drifting off to sleep when one of the men shouted, "It's a ship!" And sure enough, a bright light was heading toward them. "No," another man said, "it's just lightning." But the light was getting bigger and brighter. George stared at that light, afraid that if he even blinked it would disappear, but soon he could see the outline of a gigantic ship steaming toward them. He whispered to Marco, who barely fluttered his eyes. He pulled his friends closer, rubbing his arms. "It won't be long," he whispered. "Hang on." As the sky brightened, George gaped at the scene around him. It was as if they'd fallen through a hole in the ocean and come out on the other side of the earth. There were icebergs all around them, hundreds of them, as far as George could see. They sparkled in the golden pink light. They were so beautiful, but looking at them sent a chill up George's spine. As the ship got closer, George could see that it was a passenger steamer like the Titanic. Closer and closer it came until George could read its name, Carpathia. There were people crowded on the deck looking over the rail. They were yelling and shouting and waving, but one voice rose above all others like a siren. "Papa! Papa! Giorgio!" Marco's eyes fluttered, and he smiled a little. "Enzo," he whispered. George could see the little boy waving frantically from Aunt Daisy's arms. Phoebe stood next to them, waving, with the sunlight glinting off her spectacles. "They're safe, Marco," George said. "They made it." George grabbed Marco's hand, and so did we. All right, boys and girls, now you're going to go over to the reading response question, and it's going to be the very last reading response question where you just have to tell me your thoughts on the chapter. What did you like? What didn't you like? Do you have any connections? Do you have any predictions for what might happen in our final 2 chapters that we read? Let me know if you need any help.